The guy was dead. He'd been shot through the forehead.
And concluded criminal behaviour of a few was commenced, committed, continued and concealed at the patrol commander level. Corporals and sergeants had ordered junior soldiers to carry out and then cover up executions.
In an appalling practice known as blooding.
In total, 25 elite soldiers are accused of war crimes linked to the murder of at least 39 Afghans, although the inquiry concedes there's no doubt it's failed to uncover everything.
I would never have conceived that an Australian would be doing this in the modern era, and it does undermine the Defence Force's moral authority.
Justice Brereton's report lifts the lid on a toxic warrior culture fostered by a small group of soldiers within the SAS.
The nature of all of the crimes is so disturbing and distressing. There was a set of special rules for Special Forces.
The repercussions for Australia's Special Forces have been immediate. The alleged atrocities so grave, an entire SAS squadron is being disbanded, and a meritorious unit citation awarded to Special Task Force soldiers who served after 2007 is being revoked. But inside the military, there's frustration and anger that no senior officers have yet taken responsibility. The chief believes more crimes from Afghanistan will be uncovered.
If you have a concern, raise it.
Criminal prosecutions are likely to take years, but compensation will soon be offered to families in Afghanistan. Restoring the reputation and moral credibility of Special Forces could take much longer. Andrew Green, ABC News, Canberra.
Well, the findings of the Brereton report are reverberating through the Defence Force and the government. As political editor Andrew Probyn reports, Canberra is worried Australia's international reputation will be damaged.
For a nation that's long celebrated its soldier heritage, Australia must now confront the fact that some of its military elite were little more than cold-blooded killers. In many instances, it was the killers' colleagues who were brave enough to break the unwritten rules of brotherhood, to declare where morality stands.
In my book, this is bravery of the highest order, and we owe to them, as a nation, an enormous debt of gratitude.
But to blame war atrocities on a handful of lone psychopaths would ignore a sick warrior culture that was allowed to fester, a command that lacked moral leadership, even curiosity about what was happening on the ground, allowing the poisonous influence of patrol commanders considered demigods by their subordinates. That's not to diminish the responsibility of those individuals who disproportionately and immorally used lethal force in Australia's name. The high rotation of Australia's Special Forces contributed to moral drift, as did a kill or capture program that incentivised bad behaviour.
Rules were broken, stories concocted, lies told, and prisoners killed.
Australia's international reputation will be tarnished by what's been uncovered. There are fears domestic extremists will be encouraged, but the Brereton investigation was crucial. To defend the name of the great majority who have served with honour and distinction, Australia must admit its terrible wrongdoings. And that's the silver lining on the darkest of days. At least Australia is doing something about it.
And if you're a serving or former member of the Defence Forces or a relative in need of support, you can call the Defence Family Helpline. The number is 1800 624 608. Open arms on 1800 011 046. And of course, assistance is also available at Lifeline on 131114. The Prime Minister says Australia will always act in its own national interest despite escalating pressure from China. A list of complaints about Australia's conduct has been leaked to the media by an unnamed Chinese official, and the grievances include Australia's push for a global inquiry into the origins of COVID-19 and its decision to ban Huawei from its 5G network. Here's Foreign Affairs reporter Stephen Jedgetts.
Well, it seems that the list was made public by the Chinese embassy quite deliberately. They handed it to a journalist earlier this week, seemingly for the express purpose of trying to get it out in the headlines, and of course that's worked pretty effectively. The list is not itself that remarkable, the items on it. It does go into a little bit more detail than we've seen from the Chinese before about exactly what it is that they're so displeased about, but many of them are pretty familiar. The complaints about blocking Chinese investment, anger at Australia's criticism of its handling of Hong Kong and Taiwan, as well as a broader series of complaints about a number of comments that have been made by MPs here in Canberra who are a bit more hostile to China. Now, I think what's interesting is that we're seeing a different tactic. Clearly, the embassy here feels some sort of pressure from the Foreign Ministry in Beijing, perhaps from even higher up, to put more pressure on Australia to try and get it to shift on some of these key positions. And that might be why this list was provided to journalists as an attempt to once again ratchet up that pressure on Australia. Now, the Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, was asked about the list this morning and he basically reiterated that stance, saying that Australia would not shift from its principles. Let's take a listen to what he had to say.
We will form partnerships with other countries, like with Japan or many other countries in the Indo-Pacific, and we'll do that in accordance with our interests and theirs. And that's for us to determine, and we'll respect the decisions of other countries. But our values aren't up for trade, our democracy is not up for trade, and our sovereignty is not up for trade.
So all the signs are that so far China's campaign to try and force some sort of change in Australian policy is falling on deaf ears here in Canberra.
Meantime, a senior US Navy commander has welcomed a pact between Japan and Australia to intensify military cooperation. Vice Admiral William Mert says despite rising tensions, the in-principle agreement is not aimed at China.
So as we work through the larger challenges, that kind of agreement is really helpful and encouraging to everybody in the region. There's no attempt to contain China or anyone else. We're trying to create an environment of inclusion, and that includes India, that includes Japan, that includes China. We just know that the path to the sustaining a free and open Indo-Pacific is participation by as many nations as possible under the umbrella of international norms.
Well, Prince William has welcomed an investigation into whether a BBC journalist used unethical practices to secure an interview with Princess Diana. BBC reporter Martin Bashir has been accused of using doctored bank statements to convince Diana to do the interview. Princess Diana spoke to Mr Bashir about the breakdown of her marriage in 1995, an interview that was watched by almost 23 million people.
Do you think Mrs Parker Bowles was a factor in the breakdown of your marriage?
Well, there were 3 of us in this marriage, so it was a bit crowded.
A former Supreme Court judge has been appointed to investigate the extent of the BBC's knowledge of the forged documents. Prince William says the inquiry is a step in the right direction. Now to US politics, where President Donald Trump is planning to represent his country at tomorrow's APEC Leaders Summit. Let's talk more about that and the week in the US politics. Ted Gucci is a US politics expert at Lancaster University, from where he joins us. Robert, nice to talk to you again. It is interesting that Donald Trump has not done much official in terms of presidential duties over the last 10 days or so. Why do you think he's decided to go to APEC or to talk at APEC?
Well, I think it's an opportunity for him to walk on what might be a political red carpet for a moment, to look to be presidential and to be called president one more time in a room of dignitaries. He's been pretty quiet on Twitter, making some claims that Twitter and others can't verify in terms of election fraud. This might be an opportunity, one of the last opportunities, to be on an international stage as president.
The US has now surpassed 250,000 deaths due to COVID-19. Again, we're not seeing any action coming out of his administration. His obsession continues to be with numbers. Has he essentially stopped governing?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, there's the idea of a lame duck president that doesn't necessarily have the power and is moving out of office. I mean, I don't know if this is a different way of thinking of a lame president, just who doesn't do anything and lies back. And that's not a criticism necessarily, as much as an observation that he's firing individuals within his administration and within Department of Homeland Security and other places who are disagreeing with him. And he's trying to, undermine the validity of the Electoral College, which might be a welcome thing overall for people who think that is a bit of a injustice to have people voting in addition to the popular vote for who becomes president. But he's really trying to undermine the ability of local councils and states to hold a fair democratic election.
Robert, let's talk about those sackings. I think it's numbering around 15 and counting, and we understand the head of the CIA and the FBI are next on the list. What is he trying to achieve with this, and what is that going to mean for the incoming Biden administration?
Well, it does a couple things. It gives him a sense of power again to say, you're not with the team, so you're out. Trying to give some sort of validity to the administration that he has left. I mean, the tension he's had with the intelligence community is not new. This is kind of some retribution for what's been going on over the last few years between him and the intelligence agency in the United States. But also it's making it harder for Joe Biden and his team to come in. Some of these individuals hold over into the next administration. It's not as though a new president comes in and completely cleans the slate and stacks it in their favor. This is making that transition a little bit harder. So there'll be interim people. There'll be a lot of shakeup and concern and uncertainty among individuals, especially higher-ranking individuals and agencies across the administration. And so when Biden comes in, he's going to not just have to settle things down, right? He's going to have to either keep these interim people on or replace them with his picks.
Yeah. Give us a sense of where you think his legal fight is. It seems every day they lose yet another case in the courts. Where is he focused now? Is it trying to prevent the election being declared?
Well, one of the things I mentioned just a few minutes ago is this Electoral College, and these votes are going to be certified in early December and then again in January when it goes and follows its process all the way through. And one of the things Donald Trump could be trying to do and his legal aides could be trying to do is to replace some of those electors, replace the people who are certifying these votes. So if he's not going through the courts, if he's not going through any other legal battles or threats that he has, which he seems to be dipping in and out of also by saying, we'll abandon this one, but let us back in now a few days later. He may be going at the actual individuals and trying to get people who would be favorable to him in this space. Does he have the ability to do that? Well, that's up for debate. Is that going to happen? That's also up for debate. But the thing with Donald Trump is you don't know what's going to come out of left field that could shake up the results. Do we think Joe Biden's going to be president? Well, certainly he's acting more presidential than Donald Trump already, looking into January. But we just have to wait and see how much the Trump administration and the legal aides can get in there to mess with, for a lack of a better word, the system.
Indeed. Robert, as always, thanks for your analysis.
Thanks.
Well, South Australia's recorded no new cases of coronavirus. On the same day, it entered a harsh statewide 6-day lockdown. Despite more than 20,000 tests in 48 hours, authorities are still trying to track down thousands more who may have been exposed to the virus.
A state officially in lockdown from the stroke of midnight. Roads were quiet, parks empty, and usually packed beaches deserted.
I'm sure day 2, day 3 will start feeling a little bit long.
We have woken up to a very different South Australia today.
There weren't any new cases despite record testing, and the cluster was revised down by 1 case to 22.
3 of those people are hospitalised but stable, and we've also got 17 suspected cases which we are treating as cases.
SA's Chief Public Health Officer says the lockdown has created a window for a contact tracing blitz before the virus can spread further. Exercise outside the home isn't allowed, but walking to a shop to buy essentials is.
If you take your dog with you or not is a matter for you.
Shopping for alcohol is permitted too. That's designed to prevent a different kind of health crisis, withdrawal and mental illness.
Unfortunately, in Australia, we've got many people who are dependent on alcohol and are addicted to alcohol.
As the shock of the change begins to subside, more questions are emerging over how the virus ended up in the community. The police commissioner today visibly angered by questions about whether a Medi Hotel security guard should have been allowed to keep a second job at a pizza bar.
You're being completely unreasonable. These people have lives. Now, if we ask these people, including police and nurses, to go into quarantine when they're not at work, we will not have people doing this job.
Victoria's inquiry recommended that staff work only at one site and hold only one kind of job. Daniel Andrews today acting on that recommendation.
Everybody who works in this program will either work for the Victorian Government or be exclusively contracted for this purpose and this purpose only.
SA's Premier has promised a thorough review. Isabel Damon, ABC News, Adelaide.
Another potential COVID-19 vaccine has raised hopes it could protect those most vulnerable to the disease after producing a strong immune result in older adults. Researchers say data from mid-stage trials of the AstraZeneca and Oxford University vaccine shows robust antibody and T-cell responses. Late-stage trials are ongoing to confirm the findings, with the first data due possibly in coming weeks. The Oxford-AstraZeneca project had been a front-runner in global efforts to develop a vaccine, but rivals Pfizer and Moderna recently released data showing more than 90 up to even 95% efficacy from late-stage trials. And Pfizer will seek US approval for its vaccine after final trial results showed it's 95% effective. Out of more than 40,000 volunteers, 170 contracted the virus, but 162 of those were given a placebo. Only one vaccinated person had any severe reaction. Pfizer says the vaccine works equally well in people of all ages and ethnicities. Meanwhile, China says Sinovac's preliminary results are promising, but it produced lower antibodies than in recovered patients. In Japan, Tokyo has now moved to the highest alert level after the biggest daily increase in COVID infections. There were nearly 500 new cases in the city yesterday. The Prime Minister has urged people to wear masks even when they are eating and drinking. Well, let's go back to the UK, where Prince William has welcomed a new investigation into just how the BBC secured a famous interview with his mother after accusations that she had been tricked into taking part. The new inquiry is to be led by a former Supreme Court Justice, which will focus on how the broadcaster obtained the interview and whether executives covered up any wrongdoing. Let's go to long-time royal commentator and journalist Richard Fitzwilliams, who joins us out of London. Richard, good to have you on the program. Did the BBC have any other choice but to agree to this investigation?
After the material that has emerged recently, 25 years since Diana's infamous or famous interview, whichever you agree with, in Panorama, we now realise that there was so much more to it. The BBC had absolutely no choice whatsoever to agree to have an independent inquiry into it. New Director General Tim Davie has set this in motion. It's completely unprecedented for a senior member of the royal family to intervene in this way, but obviously this is a very special case.
Indeed. So I'd like to talk about Prince William actually commenting on it. But of course, the revelations suggest that she was either tricked or misled into agreeing to this interview, which really changed the course of her life.
You're absolutely right. We had not previously realised the extent to which Martin Bashir, who conducted the interview, had apparently tricked Lord Spencer, who was Diana's brother, in a whole series of points. Earl Spencer made notes of some 32 points, which included forged bank statements, but not only the ones that we knew about, because the Daily Mail did release details of this in 1996. Diana was febrile at the time. She was desperately nervous. She believed she was being spied on, and what we did not know, and this is just among the details that have come to light, is the fact that Bashir told Earl Spencer that Diana's private secretary and also Prince of Wales's were on the pay of MI5. And I mean, there's a web of deceit here. We need to know what happened.
And particularly because we know that paranoia, that sense of distrust in the establishment that she had come to have potentially led to her, trusting others for her security that could have led to her death.
You're absolutely right, and that terrible conclusion is, I think, in the minds of a lot of people, because if she believed, as she obviously did when Earl Spencer realized that Bashir was a liar, his warning came too late. Her fears had already been confirmed. She went ahead with the bombshell interview, which of course is still deeply controversial. It poisoned her relations with the palace, and as you refer, this also affected royal security, and the fact that tragically, when she died, she believed that those who were in the employ of the royal family for security purposes might very well be her enemies. This changed the course of her life, and we want to know more, and we will be hearing a great deal more, but it will be, I think, very uncomfortable, certainly for the BBC.
Indeed. It is interesting, too, that it comes at a time, Richard, where The Crown, this very successful series on Netflix, is airing, and this particular relationship is getting a lot more attention, the very fractured relationship between Prince Charles and Diana. This is always an uncomfortable subject for the palace.
There's no question that it is a very difficult subject for the palace, for the marriage was both a nightmare and a disaster that should never have taken place. I watched all 10 episodes of The Crown, and being an admirer of the first 2 seasons, having doubts about the way Peter Morgan, its creator, was handling the third, I have to report that sadly the sensational aspect of royal life is what is emphasised in the 4th series, and this is a great pity. There's no doubt that Emma Corrin's extremely good as Diana, but Josh O'Connor's Prince of Wales is a terrible wimp, and as for the royal family, they're portrayed as duplicitous, cold, callous and deceitful, and as ill-mannered as well. So I have to say that what we've seen here not only takes so many liberties with fact, but also I found a lot of it tasteless, even though, of course, it is dramatic, and then you've got the clash between the Queen and Margaret Thatcher too. So there are those who will be fascinated by it, but be warned, what you see very often isn't what happened, and it could have been better done, in my opinion.
Yeah, and that's a very good warning from you. Richard, appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
Pleasure.
Well, Israel has been accused of using the remaining weeks of the Trump presidency to make it far more difficult for Palestinians to achieve their own state. This week, it has invited tenders for a controversial housing development in Palestinian territory that would block access between Bethlehem and East Jerusalem. Here's our Middle East correspondent, Eric Torchek.
Jewish settlers tried to stop European diplomats from visiting a controversial development site.
Don't interfere with our issues, with our business, and stop being anti-Semitic.
Under international law, the area is considered part of the occupied Palestinian territories, but the Israeli government has invited tenders to build 1,250 homes here.
This is the first time since 23 years that such a major construction initiative and plan has been authorized by the Israeli authorities.
The development would separate Palestinian towns in the West Bank from suburbs in East Jerusalem, which Palestinians want as their capital of a future state.
Go
back to your country.
Opponents say it's a shameless move to block Palestinian aspirations before President Trump leaves office.
It feels as if it's the last hurrah of the Trump administration and its policy towards Israel and Palestine.
US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo is in Israel for what's probably his last visit in that role.
I ask you to convey to President Trump my deep appreciation and the appreciation of our grateful nation for all he and his administration have done for the state of Israel and for peace.
He witnessed the historic agreement between Israel and Bahrain to open embassies and allow travel between the two nations. It's only possible because of a deal struck in Washington for Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates to recognise Israel. Palestinians are angry Mr Pompeo plans to visit a winery in a Jewish settlement in the West Bank, as well as the Golan Heights, considered occupied Syrian territory, but declared by President Trump as now part of Israel. They're holding out hope for a different approach under Joe Biden, but there are still 2 months left in Donald Trump's term. Eric Twarchek, ABC News, Jerusalem.
Relatives of the victims of the Pike River mine disaster have commemorated 10 years since the tragedy, one of New Zealand's worst industrial accidents. 29 men were killed when a series of blasts ignited by methane gas ripped through the mine on the South Island. 2 men were able to escape. Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern says the tragedy left a scar on the nation.
10 years ago today, 31 men went to work at the Pike River mine. 29 of those men never came home. There is nothing relative about grief. Sudden loss is devastating. But 10 years ago, New Zealand saw a disaster and grief that was so gut-wrenching, it was almost unimaginable.
Rescue efforts were delayed due to a build-up of poisonous gases before a second explosion 5 days later ended any hope of finding survivors. 2 Russian cosmonauts are conducting a spacewalk outside the International Space Station. The 2 men, both named Sergei, are taking part in the 6-hour spacewalk to prepare for a new docking module. The excursion comes 2 days after the arrival of 4 astronauts on a commercial ferry flight. Well, to what in the world? And if you've ever driven down a highway and spotted a sign that doesn't look quite right, this electronic sign was on the side of a highway in the Canadian alpine town of Jasper, warning motorists, do not let moose lick your car. It may sound like a joke, but this is actually a serious problem in parts of Canada where rock salt is used to melt ice and snow on highways near big moose populations. And they love the taste of rock salt. They've discovered they can access a near endless supply by licking the panels of cars. Now, it has led to some rather hilarious interactions between moose and motorists. It does, though, pose severe safety hazards for both. Importantly, the sign flashes the same message in French. Our top stories tonight on The World. Defence Chief Angus Campbell offers an apology in the wake of the Afghanistan war crimes report. Prime Minister Scott Morrison says Australia will not back down to threats from China. And Britain's Prince William backs an inquiry into the BBC's Princess Diana interview. Now to Behind the Wall with Stan Grant and the deteriorating relationship between Australia and China. And Stan, to quote China, if you make China the enemy, China will be the enemy. Is that a declaration of diplomatic war?
Well, this is where we've been heading, Bev. I mean, if you look at our relationship right now, it is not wrong to call this Cold War 2.0. In fact, you could make an argument that the Cold War never ended in China. Of course, when the Berlin Wall came down and the Soviet Empire came to an end later in 1991, China remained the single biggest communist power in the world. And that tension has remained, even though China has opened up to the world and built its economic and financial links with other parts of the world. And of course, we have a very deep trade relationship. When it comes to politics, when it comes to what China sees as its its own sphere of influence, it has been very protective. It has pushed back against criticism, and we've seen this ratcheting up in recent times. This has something to do with Xi Jinping and the way Xi Jinping sees the world. He believes that China has a rightful place at the apex of global power. He is increasing China's influence throughout the world. It also goes to something deeply etched in the Chinese psyche, Bev, and that is this idea of the 100 years of humiliation, that the Chinese will not take being pushed around by foreign powers. They had enough of that from the Opium War in the mid-1840s, 1850s, right through to the Japanese occupation in the 1930s and 40s. So when Australia criticises China, when it raises criticism about things like the detention of Uyghurs or the crackdown on democracy in Hong Kong, when it questions the coronavirus, handling of coronavirus, and calls for an inquiry, that touches really red-hot buttons inside China. I think another thing to look at is the Australia-Japan military alliance we've seen announced this week. Don't forget that Japan, in the eyes of so many in China, remains an implacable enemy. They may have better diplomatic ties and a close trade relationship, but the wounds there run deep as well. So it is not difficult to understand why we are seeing this pushback right now and how much more complicated it makes for us to manage this critical relationship.
But Stan, why has Australia been singled out for such anger, such ridicule? We're certainly not seeing Scott Morrison take a backward step, but it's become a very difficult relationship and situation to try and rescue.
That is a fantastic question, Bev, and it goes something to do with our proximity in the world. We are in Asia, and of course China sees itself as the preponderant power of Asia. If you look at the view from Beijing, Beijing says, look, we're the biggest engine of economic growth in the world. By the end of this decade, we are likely to overtake the United States as the single biggest economic power in the world. It is our economic strength that helped to drag Australia through the worst of the global financial crisis that gave Australia 30 years of uninterrupted economic growth. So that's how China sees the Australia relationship now. Australia's close strategic ties, its alliance with the United States, puts it very much at this hinge point of history, Bev, the rising China, and perhaps we can see a waning American power in the world, and we are right there. We are right at that hinge point. A lot of the world is looking at us, in fact, and saying, how does Australia manage this? Because Australia is clearly going to come in for extra criticism because of where we are geographically and because of our trade ties. How does Australia manage this? Is Australia able to effectively balance its strategic interests with the US and its trade interests with China? We are, in many respects, Bev, the canary in the coal mine. And if you think that this week, of course, also marked 1 year since the first outbreak of coronavirus in Wuhan, I think coronavirus has accelerated. It has revealed a lot of the fault lines in the world, but it has also accelerated them. A virus that came out of China has significantly weakened the United States, and this also plays into it, with Australia's criticism of China and, of course, calling for that inquiry into the outbreak of coronavirus. We want to have a look back now at this past year, how coronavirus broke out, the impact it had, and how China has handled it.
China has identified the cause of the mysterious pneumonia outbreak in Wuhan City, and it's from the same family that caused the deadly SARS epidemic 17 years ago.
The government's bombshell in the early hours of the morning presented people with an impossible choice. Stay in the city for who knows how long in the midst of an escalating epidemic, or try to get out quick smart.
I'll give you guys an idea. The city's empty, man. Like, the population's 11 million people. I can only see maybe 1 or 2 people on the street.
A city under quarantine with no idea how long it'll be cut off from the world.
In Wuhan, an extraordinary project is taking shape to build 2 hospitals with hundreds of beds within weeks.
Officials in the city of Wuhan, where the global pandemic began, yesterday reported an increase of 50% in coronavirus fatalities, taking the death count to 3,869.
Yesterday, Wuhan reported no new cases for the first time since the outbreak started.
Today, the most affected province in China from the coronavirus, Hubei, is going to ease travel restrictions.
As the clock struck midnight, the gates to the city opened. After 76 days, finally something to celebrate.
Wuhan provides hope for the rest of the world, that even the most severe situation can be turned around.
Professor Dale Fisher is the Chair of Infection Control at the National University of Singapore. He's also the Chair of the World Health Organisation's Outbreak Alert and Response Network. And he joins me now from Singapore. Professor, it's good to have you on the program. You were in China earlier this year. Just tell us what you took away from that trip.
Thanks for having me, Stan. It was there was a couple of weeks build up and looking at the type of things that we might want to find from the mission. And it was a technical mission where we were really trying to learn as much as we could. The Chinese had already had over a month's experience with it. So this was about trying to understand more about the transmission, the severity, how it clustered, who were the vulnerable groups. And I think the mission report from that has stood the test of time, really. The most profound thing that I noticed when I was there, though, was how this virus had brought China to its knees. Beijing, the skies were clear blue. There was nobody on the streets. There were very few cars. And having been to Beijing a few times in the past, it was really extraordinary.
Yeah, well, having lived in Beijing for many years, you don't often see blue skies, so that is remarkable. You were there, of course, during the period when this was at its peak, but it had actually broken out several months before that. Did you look at that initial response? Because there's been a lot of criticism of that initial response from China.
To be honest, it was scoped out. We felt that the best investment in our time was really going to see how the rest of the world could protect itself. So it was really technical about the virus, about the interventions, and getting the message out to the rest of the world that this was a very serious situation. So actually trying to work out how it jumped species or where it came from originally, we felt would be best addressed at another time.
Now, we know, of course, that China was able to crack down once it really did zero in on this, and there was lockdown, and some of the images at the time were quite extraordinary, stark, really, very confronting when you see buildings locked down and people being dragged out of buildings in some cases. Of course, we've seen that then play out in other parts of the world, including Australia.
Exactly. The things that you've always got to be careful before you start criticising any other place, because you're quite right. We thought lockdowns, that's absolutely unacceptable in any other society. But now we see that too often it's the mainstay of interventions, and and people have had to get serious.
It does raise a question, given how successfully China appears to have dealt with this. It raises questions about what type of government, what type of regime is more suited to this sort of emergency. China surely would sit there and say, well, our system of government was able to deal with this perhaps more effectively than, say, a country like the United States. Is that a fair enough assessment?
I think it's a little, perhaps a little simplistic. There's most of East Asia are democracies. They may not be exactly the same as democracies in other parts of the world, and sure there are perhaps cultural differences between populations, but by and large this is all about community engagement, and if you can rally your community with sound scientific decisions, then obviously any country, I think, is capable of doing it. But whether you do it as a doctrine or whether you do it as an explanation and appealing to people's community or sense of community engagement, then yeah, governments have to do it in different ways for their own populations.
It's interesting you mentioned some of the other Asian countries. You were involved in the response there in Singapore, which had varying degrees of success, but certainly if you compare it to places like the United States or Europe has been able to manage this. But other countries such as Taiwan, Japan, which stayed open, did not go into complete lockdown. What made those countries' response more effective? Was it because they'd had experience with this, they'd learnt the lessons from SARS? Is there a cultural aspect to this as well?
Well, I think there is a cultural aspect in some sense. There's probably a stronger sense of community responsibility over individual rights, if you like. So people would understand that there are things they do for the community's greater good, and it's not about what's right for me and what I want to do. So for instance, masks are mandated in Singapore, but it wouldn't be a problem anyway. You would feel very awkward going out in Singapore without wearing a mask, and you'd probably get people looking at you, probably walking around you, giving you a fair bit of leeway, and you would feel uncomfortable. So yeah, people do develop a sense of community responsibility.
Now, if we look at the criticism of China, and there's been, of course, those calls for an inquiry into the origins of coronavirus in Wuhan, and that coming from Australia, which has created strain in that relationship or contributed to strain in that relationship. From your assessment, was that unnecessary or was that handled poorly?
I recall the events, obviously, and this investigation was always going to happen. When we were in China, we actually, without specifically asking, we were seeing a lot of results of swabs on animals, swabs on the environment, because they were really trying to see if there was a sort of an intermediate species going from bats to humans, and we saw results of thousands of animal tests. So I hear what you're saying, and I agree. I don't think there was a fight that needed to be picked, but maybe Australia didn't realise it was picking a fight. I'm not sure, but this was going to happen anyway, and it's really difficult, scientifically and politically.
Well, now, of course, this week marks a year since that first outbreak in Wuhan. We're now apparently on the cusp of having a vaccine. A lot of these trials have been very successful thus far. How much store do you place in that? Can we relax after we get the vaccine, or how long is this going to be with us?
So I think the first thing to understand is that this is only hope. We're not any different today than we were last week. Everything has to keep applying, whatever your national or state strategy is. So I think there's still too many unknowns. We don't really understand, well, we obviously don't understand how long this will last for, and if the effect wanes after 3 or 4 months, then really the vaccine is little use to us. So they've only been going for 2 months now on thousands of patients. So as we get longer periods of time, more patients, we still don't know the effect or the benefits on elderly or on children or on immune suppressed groups, who are all the people that we want to protect. So it's great news, don't get me wrong, and it really is serious light at the end of the tunnel that this way of manufacturing a vaccine seems to be working. It's the best news we could have had, but still I'm very wary of the way the world has been drip-fed information over the last year, and people celebrate and then, oh, it's not so good after all. And that's not fair. People talk about this outbreak fatigue, And that's a good way to wear you down, I think, is get your hopes up and then say, oh, we've got some bad news. So I think we just take it as very hopeful, but we stayed true to the course.
Professor, it's been a pleasure to talk to you on the program. Thank you again for giving us your time.
My pleasure, Stan.
All right, back to the APEC summit, and it is expected President Donald Trump will represent the United States. It'll be his first time attending the major forum since 2017, and it's one where China's Xi Jinping will also be taking part. Hosted by Malaysia, the event will be conducted virtually, of course, because of the pandemic. Here's Yvonne Young.
This week, Asia-Pacific leaders outlined the need for free and fair trade practices to drive economic recovery from the pandemic.
There is now a real and specific necessity to ensure a delicate balance between our health priorities and economic needs.
Specifically, the CEO dialogues today focused on what the priorities should be and how countries can work together in the aftermath of coronavirus.
That could be very timely in the pandemic situation of how we can share resources, how we can share expertise and learn from one another.
Leaders called for open and multilateral trade, with Chinese President Xi Jinping in his keynote speech rejecting protectionism and saying globalization is irreversible.
We will not reverse course or run against the historical trend by decoupling or forming a small circle to keep others out.
If Donald Trump participates in Friday's Leaders Forum, it would be his first time since 2017. Last year's APEC summit did not go ahead after host Chile backed out due to violent protests at home. In 2018, Vice President Mike Pence represented the US amid heightened tensions between Washington and Beijing. The US Chamber of Commerce says it's concerned the US is being left behind after 15 nations across the Asia-Pacific this week inked the largest free trade agreement, cementing China's dominant role in regional trade. The US is absent from both the RCEP and the successor to the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which Donald Trump withdrew from after taking office in 2017. Some are hoping for more engagement with the United States under a Joe Biden administration. Yvonne Yong, ABC News.
And China continues to lash out, saying any attempt by foreign states to threaten or pressure Beijing to make concessions is doomed to fail. The Foreign Ministry was responding to the Five Eyes intelligence sharing group, which said new rules to disqualify elected legislators in Hong Kong appear to be part of a campaign to silence critics.
No matter whether they have 5 eyes or 10 eyes, as long as they dare to harm China's sovereignty, security or development interests, they should be careful not to get their eyes poked out. We express our strong dissatisfaction and resolute opposition to all relevant countries' flagrant violations of international law and for making irresponsible remarks on Hong Kong's affairs that are China's internal affairs.
More COVID tests are being promised in French schools after 2 weeks of violent clashes between students and police. Pupils are angry they've been forced to remain in crowded classrooms while the rest of the country is in lockdown. France has the most cases in Europe, with more than 2.1 million infections. Europe correspondent Nick Dole was there as the protests flared up.
It wasn't much of a barricade. A few bins were all they could muster. And it was no match for police, who were determined to snuff out this demonstration before it really got started. French authorities want to keep schools open, and after a dose of pepper spray, this protester learnt the lengths they'll go to avoid disruption.
The government, they just want us to work like little dogs, and it's not possible. We are scared. We are scared for our families, for ourselves.
In the neighbouring suburb, these students managed to block the door to their school. It didn't last long. Police, some in plain clothes, push the students back. Those who resist are threatened with batons and pepper spray.
This is police brutality. We don't want to protest against the police, but against the government, so they don't have to be so rough and brutal with us.
French schools were closed during the first lockdown, but the government says this time round it's essential they stay open so children aren't left behind. Officials say just 0.1% of the country's students tested positive in the past week and that masks offer some protection. But the pupils at this school aren't feeling it.
These students say the health situation in their classrooms is an emergency. They say they've been trying to get a meeting with education officials, but no one's listening. And so it's come to this: school students in skirmishes with police on the streets of Paris.
North of the capital, protesters vandalised a patrol car. One police union says it proves some of the demonstrators aren't innocent children. But here, it's clear plenty of them are.
Instead of helping us, what they just found it to do is attack us.
The government has offered a compromise and agreed to let senior students study from home part-time. The rest are expected to stay in class, and the state will use all its power to ensure that occurs. Nick Dole, ABC News, Paris.
Boeing 737 MAX has been cleared for takeoff nearly 2 years after the fleet was grounded after 2 deadly crashes. The plane was involved in accidents in Indonesia and Ethiopia, which killed 346 people. It's the longest ban in commercial aviation history, costing Boeing $27 billion. Investigators focused on anti-stall software and a faulty sensor. Regulators say airlines must now complete system and training upgrades on the 737 MAX before they can fly again. Stargazers got excited last night when a bright green light lit up Tasmania's southern skies just before 10 o'clock. And it wasn't the Aurora Australis, it was a meteor. And as luck would have it, it was perfectly captured by the live stream video on board the CSIRO research vessel Investigator. The ship, which was 100 kilometres south of Tassie at the time, and scientists on board say they were astounded by the size and brightness of the meteor. Melbourne Storm's Harry Grant has played a starring role in the Maroons' upset state of origin.